having some good adventures.
Yeah.
Little travels.
Yep. So it was fun.
I just got to Boston for my first time ever, but I didn't really go to Boston. I went to Maynard, which is outside Boston, next to Concord.
Oh.
So I got to see Louisa May Alcott's grave. Oh, cried.
Oh, no.
Cool. I was like, this is way better than Hollywood graves, you know? It was really cool. But my niece had a baby, so I got to meet, she was 3 months old, Theodora Payson Wigfield.
Hello.
Of the New England Wigfields.
Of course.
I know getting around Ann Arbor is really difficult these days, so it may be that we'll have some people coming in late. And after these lovely people who come in, anybody after this, when somebody comes in, I want everybody to turn and look at them.
Welcome. I like your top.
Okay, so good evening, and welcome to Making Michigan, the Bentley Library's series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Gary Krenz, the director of the Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory, which is a division of the Bentley. I'm pleased to welcome both our online audience and our in-person audience here at the observatory. Thank you all for coming tonight. Tonight we offer our second edition of Wolverine Writers with some stories that, as our subtitle indicates, deal with fire and ice and rebirth. Part of the mission of the Detroit Observatory and of our parent institution, the Bentley, is to promote appreciation and understanding of the history of the University of Michigan. We are, of course, not alone in this, and I'm thrilled to welcome three individuals who, as editors and writers, are also contributing to this understanding through the stories they write and publish. I think you'll find the stories they discuss penetrating, insightful, and moving. So our panelists are, in the order in which they will speak, Kim Clark. Kim is the manager of Heritage Communications at the University of Michigan, a role that evolved out of her work as director of communications for U of M's bicentennial. I had the really great pleasure of working with Kim on the bicentennial. She manages the U of M Heritage Project, an award-winning collection of narrative stories exploring the university's past. She previously was director of executive communications for President Mary Sue Coleman. Twice, I suppose you could say. Right?
I liked it so much I did it again.
She has worked as a reporter and editor at several newspapers in Michigan. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Central Michigan University and a master's in American culture from Eastern Michigan University. Next will be Lara Zeeland. Lara is the editorial director for the Bentley Historical Library. Twice each year, she produces the library's award-winning magazine, Collections. You can get copies in the lobby before you leave if you want, while also overseeing the library's digital storytelling through newsletters, multiple websites, and social media. And she has, of course, been a great help with the observatories and Making Michigan's communications. Lara is a published fiction author, a true crime addict, and her podcast, Archive Unknown, explores strange, spooky, and unusual collections in archives all across the country, and I recommend it. Deborah Holdship. Deborah is the editor of Michigan Today, a digital monthly magazine distributed by email to about 475,000 U of M graduates, faculty, and staff worldwide. She also produces the podcast Listen In Michigan, which she describes as an audio postcard to alumni from their old Ann Arbor stomping grounds. Deborah joined the university in 2007 as the editorial manager in marketing communications at the Ross School of Business. Prior to Ross, she could be found at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. And before that, Deborah had been working in entertainment in Los Angeles, where she was a reporter and editor at Billboard magazine and an editor and video producer at Launch Media. Her great claim to Hollywood fame was seeing her byline on the silver screen in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. When a headline about their band appeared on page one of Billboard, she just happened to have a front page story in the issue that they used for the film. So we're about to get started, and I want to note, as we've indicated in our communications about this event and on the screen here, our first talk is going to mention one person's experience with suicide. Please use care and know that support is available if you are someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide or mental health issues. Please note that resources are available as we're shown on the screen. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim, and we'll do a little juggling of technology here, and then we'll get going. So let me give you
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. And thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. I want to talk about a story that's on the Heritage Project website called The Arsonist Was a Scholar. And I want to talk a bit about the story, behind the story, how the story came about. Because I started out thinking it was going to be one story, and it turned out to be something completely different. I was really interested in the impact of a major fire on campus and how that would affect faculty members' careers because of the materials that were lost in this fire. So I looked at the Haven Hall fire, which happened this month in 1950. Haven Hall at the time was located north of Angell Hall, west of the Krauss Science Building, Natural Science Building. Today it's the Kinesiology Building. It was a very old building on campus, so it had no trouble burning. And in fact, a few years earlier, the Ann Arbor Fire Department had told the university, you need to tear this building down, it's a fire trap. But it went up, and it was quite 20,000 people lined the streets to watch it burn. As you can see in this photo on the left, students climbed up the fire escapes, helping the firefighters with the hoses and also helping to remove stuff from the building, remove papers and books and typewriters and desk chairs and whatever they could salvage. The building housed the history department, sociology, journalism, and a couple of smaller institutes. So I'm thinking about what happened to the faculty member and the materials that were lost. Well, as you can see, it was just a charcoal briquette by the end of things. People lost everything. It was final exam week when this happened, so finals were lost, final reports, theses, personal libraries of faculty members, as well as many books they had borrowed from the university library. To give you one example of a loss, Dwight, who was a Civil War historian, who was writing a book on what he believed the causes of the Civil War were. He lost 500 rare anti-slavery pamphlets, 600 photographs and negatives from the Civil War era, 400 books, many of them rare, about the Civil War, and 5,000 bibliography cards of all of his research sources.
Oh,
Doesn't that kind of make you sick to think about that? And that happened office after office after office in this building. The fire department said they had no idea what caused the fire, and they said they would probably never know. The university decided to tear down Haven Hall because it was a loss. They built a new building, which is the one that we have today on the backside of Angell Hall that faces the diag. The location, as you can see here today, it's trees, sidewalks, grass, and that's the remainders of the old Haven Hall. And so everybody moved on. In the fall of 1950, there's an arrest made. This is big news because the fire department and the police said we have no idea how this started. The suspect is a graduate student, 30 years old. His name is Robert Stacy. He started at U of M in 1939-1940 academic year. He left in 42 to serve in World War II in the Army. He served in England. He was honorably discharged in 45, came back to Ann Arbor, finished his bachelor's degree, finished his master's degree. He studied the classics. At the time of his arrest, he was working on his doctorate, and he was also teaching undergraduate students, as doctoral students often do. He was arrested because of this woman, largely. Her name is Zelda Clarkson. Robert Stacy and Zelda Clarkson had been boyfriend-girlfriend a couple of years earlier. It was a rocky relationship. They broke up. He didn't take that well. He would call her, write her, show up at her place. She had him arrested once. And then she moved out of town. That summer of 1950, after the fire, he shows up unannounced and uninvited at her home on Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And among other things tells her, I set the fire at Haven Hall. I was feeling a great deal of stress and tension, and this relieved all of that. So she felt that he was mentally ill, and she petitioned the court to have him involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. In her petition, she included his confession about setting the fire. That's caught the eye of the authorities. That's what led to him being arrested. Police said that when they interrogated him, he not only confessed to setting the Haven Hall fire, but he said he set several smaller fires that had broken out on campus that spring, and that he had taken several purses. There had been a number of purse snatchings on campus. Jeez. He later recanted all these confessions. He went on trial. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated 3 hours. They found him guilty. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years at Southern Michigan Prison in Jackson, which at the time was the roughest prison in the state. So I'm kind of intrigued by this. I'm still working on research about with the faculty member and their careers, but I'm kind of curious, who's Robert Stacy? So I asked the Bentley for their alumni files, and they have one on Robert. And this is his admissions application to Michigan. And it tells me a little bit more about him. He grew up in Manhattan. He went to high school in Western New York State. He was living with his aunt and uncle at the time he graduated from high school. His mother died when he was 16. She had a heart problem. His father was hospitalized. He was a good student, not a great student, but a good student. His application includes reference letters from teachers and his principal, as you would expect in an application. They all say he's a really good student. He has all the potential to succeed in college and to be a success. He said in his application that he wanted to be a college professor. That was his career aspiration. They said he could do that. And yet, every reference letter has a qualifier. Everybody said he's brilliant, but he's troubled. He is withdrawn. He will not socialize. He's erratic. He's moody. He's depressed. And we've tried. They talked with his aunt and uncle who were raising him. His aunt and uncle were absolutely baffled as to why they couldn't get him to engage. So this tells me a little bit about the guy behind the fire. But I'm still focusing on these faculty and their research losses. So at the time, I start to look at the papers of Alexander Ruthven, who was the president of the university at the time, thinking there's letters in there from professors talking about their career is ruined, or would you help me rebuild, or can I get an extra sabbatical, or whatever. And in there I find a letter from Robert Stacy that he has written to Ruthven while he's in jail awaiting trial. And he says, my career is over. It doesn't matter if I'm acquitted or convicted. The newspapers have ruined me. My reputation is shot. He says he feels betrayed by his university. Nobody has ever spoken out in his defense. Nobody has come to visit him. He says he is mentally ill, but he's been treated at what was called the Veterans Readjustment Center, which the university created for World War II veterans. And he also alludes to the fact that he tried to take his life. And that had been in the newspapers after he was arrested. He had made a couple attempts on his life. Nothing that required hospitalization. The guards always were able to intervene. In this letter to President Ruthven, he makes what seems like a confession. He says, no one but myself is directly responsible for the present situation. And then a couple of pages later, he says, I am innocent. I am being accused of guilt where guilt does not in reality exist. He says he's confident he's going to be acquitted, but of course he was not. He is sentenced to prison. He serves 6.5 years at Jackson. While he's a prisoner, he teaches classes to other inmates, and he also writes a column for a newspaper run by the prisoners. He is paroled in 1957 in June, the 7-year anniversary of the Haven Hall fire. And, end of story. But now I'm really kind of interested, who is this guy? What happened to him? Well, he starts over. He starts over at this university, Syracuse, in western New York State. He enrolls in graduate school. Within a year of being at Syracuse, he's an instructor. He's teaching in a program run by the university and the Air Force. He's teaching Russian to American airmen. It's the Cold War. Within about 10 years, he's got his PhD from Syracuse. He's on the faculty. He's earned tenure. And he's chair of the Department of Slavic Languages. Now I am really interested in this guy. It's like, holy cats. I decided I'm going to focus the story on the resurrection of his career. As a faculty member, he does what professors do. He writes books. His area of expertise is Russian literature. He supervises dissertations. He writes journal articles, including one with this woman. Her name is Olga Federoff. When he was teaching Russian to Air Force airmen, she was working as a Russian translator in the same program. She was married at the time. They became friends. When her husband passed away, she and Robert Stacy married. So he spent 27 years on the faculty at Syracuse University, and he retired in 1985. And he and Olga made a home in the suburbs of Syracuse. He passed away at the age of 74 in 1994, never having told anybody about his past, seemingly. So I'm still really curious, how did this happen? I noticed in his obituary that his survivors included stepchildren, Olga Federoff's children, who are all adults at this point in time. So one of them is a woman named Nina Federoff. She, like her stepfather, is a scholar. She's a retired professor at Penn State. She's a geneticist. She's also a National Medal of Science laureate, and she served as science advisor to Hillary Clinton and Condoleezza Rice when they were Secretary of State. So with some trepidation, I write her an email to say, here's the story I'm working on. Here's what I know about this fire. Here's what I know about Robert Stacy. Is it anything he ever discussed with you as a family? Nope. She said I had no idea. Her email is like, I am absolutely stunned by this. She said, could you send me a little more information to make sure we're talking about the right guy? So I sent some photos and a little more personal detailed birth dates and stuff. And she said, yes, that is him. She said he was a very closed off person, very difficult to reach. She said he always deflected questions about his past. She said she talked with her brothers. Neither of them were aware of this. She doesn't think their mother ever knew. She's passed away. She said, I think he buried this so deep that it was never going to come out. She said by the end of his life, he was a severe alcoholic, and he was quite depressed, and he had a lot of medical issues. And then she told me one more thing that was like, can this story get any crazier? That when he died at age 74, it was by his own hand. He took his own life after all those earlier attempts. He had went for a walk one day, he didn't come home, and he had overdosed on all of his heart medication.
Wow.
So I said, I think this sounds like a really tragic story. And she disagreed. She said, it was sad because he couldn't share his pain and he couldn't convey what he was feeling. She said he was depressed, and that could have been because of the medical issues he was having. It could have been because of the mix of medications he was on. But she said he achieved his life's goal, and that was to become a university professor. He got his doctorate, he taught students, and that's what he did for his life. So that is the story of the arsonist who was a scholar. Wow. And I have one sad little addendum. I mentioned that when he was in high school, he lived with his aunt and uncle because his mother had passed away and his dad was in the hospital. I had written to the state of New York for his father's death certificate because I couldn't learn anything about what happened to him. And it arrived about a year after we published this story. His father had been hospitalized in a psychiatric facility for a couple of years, and he also took his life. So there's clearly a family history here. But it's a fascinating story in my opinion, and I appreciate being able to share it with you. Thank you.
Wow.
Oh, yes.
Speaking of true crime, I can't imagine writing for someone's death certificate. You know?
Oh, that's me.
I'm like, wow, that's so cool.
Well, thanks everyone so much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to be discussing Tragedy on the Ice, the story about U of M's connection to an ill-fated polar expedition in the late 1800s. So, oh yeah, is it true? Okay. Okay. So this story starts, like many do for me, with a colleague sharing something strange that they found at the Bentley Historical Library where I work. And it's really my favorite thing of all time. So in this case, my colleague Andrew Rutledge told me about the alumni file of a young U of M student named Edward Israel. And tucked inside this file was a handwritten copy of a journal article about Edward after Edward died tragically at the age of 25. The article was written by the Detroit Observatory's third director, a man named Mark Walrod Harrington, who was Israel's mentor while Israel was at U of M. But here's where it gets a little strange. Harrington wrote the article and published it in the American Meteorological Journal, which is an unusual place for what was essentially a profile piece. Even back then, it really wasn't commonplace for a faculty member to write about a former student, especially one who wasn't really a scholar in the field. So Andrew and I were like, what's the deal here? Why would Harrington write this article? What was his relationship to Edward Israel? So to answer those questions, Andrew began to investigate and wound up writing a piece in the spring 2023 issue of Collections magazine based on his research. And in the process, I became really interested in this story as well and wanted to learn everything that I could about Edward Israel and Mark Walrod Harrington and what was going on here. And so I'd like to start this story by taking you back in time to 1877. And that is when our hero, Edward Israel, gets accepted into the University of Michigan. Edward is young and good looking. He's 5'9". He's got dark hair and dark eyes, and he's also whip smart. He loves mathematics, and his professors at the University of Michigan can pretty quickly see that he's special. It's also worth noting that he's the only Jewish student in his class. His family was the only Jewish family in Kalamazoo, Michigan at the time where they settled and where Edward grew up. So Edward's breaking barriers and learning about astronomy, and while he's doing that, something else is simultaneously afoot. A man named Omar Dwight Conger, he's a senator from Michigan, and he's in the process of introducing a bill in the House of Representatives to authorize and equip an Arctic expedition. So here's Omar. Now, for some context here, this is a time when people were really interested in the Arctic and especially the North Pole, and there were a couple of reasons for this. One was the idea that there was something called the Northwest Passage at the top of the world, and this would be a shortcut for ships sailing between Europe and Asia that would mean no more sailing around Africa in order to trade. And the thought was that perhaps there was also this thing called the open polar sea, which were warm waters at the top of the planet once you got through all of that ice and cold. So scientists wanted to learn more about what was happening up at the top of the Earth and in these extreme locations. So that is what led to an initiative called the International Polar Year. And the idea was that scientists from around the world would join together in a global effort to record data at the Earth's furthest edges. The idea was that they really wanted to understand a plethora of things, including climate, magnetic fields, the northern lights, you name it. So countries from around the world would participate, and this included the United States. So Omar Dwight Conger introduces a bill in the House of Representatives to authorize and equip this Arctic expedition for the International Polar Year, and the government approves it, and the whole thing is off to the races. Now, the guy who's leading this International Polar Year mission for the U.S. is a guy named Lieutenant Adolphus Greeley. he's a Civil War veteran, and during the Civil War, he got part of his jaw and a bunch of teeth blown out in the Battle of Antietam. So for the rest of his life, he would wear this huge bushy beard to hide all of his injuries. After the war, he's sent out west to go build telegraph lines, and in the process, he learns a ton about meteorology and electricity, and this experience makes him an ideal candidate to lead this expedition into the Arctic for the International Polar Year. But Greeley needs a team. So he sets out a call for, among the people he needs an astronomer, and Mark Walrod Harrington is like, he hears about it, and he says, I got a guy for you. So as I mentioned at the time, Harrington is the third director of this place, the Detroit Observatory, and Edward Israel is his student. And Harrington proposes that Edward should be the experienced astronomer that the Greeley expedition needs. And Edward, for his part, he hesitates, but ultimately he decides to go. And this is when Harrington writes Lieutenant Greeley about Edward and what a great fit he'd be. And he says, quote, Edward is an unusually bright man, a member of our senior class, has a strong mathematical and scientific taste, and desires to make the pursuit of astronomy his specialty. I think he would do very credible work, and I should be glad to see him appointed. He has already signified his willingness to go. So, in fact, he's accepted, and Edward, Greeley, and 23 other men who comprise the expedition get ready to go. Here's a picture of most of them gathered together in a formal portrait before they leave. And here's Greeley wearing his full raggedy beard to hide his Civil War wounds. And here's little sweet Edward. He's looking, by contrast, pretty fresh-faced and young. And it's worth noting, I think he's literally the only person in the picture without any facial hair. So Edward and the team leave St. John's in Newfoundland in July 1881, and they sail north, and their goal is to make it to this red dot. That's Fort Conger, named for our fella Omar Dwight Conger, and that's the location of it. And then the plan is to spend 2 years there total. They're on a ship called the Proteus that takes them through ice-choked waters, sailing to that red dot on the last slide. And they really get there without much issue. It all goes pretty smooth. And once they land, Edward helps unpack all of the scientific equipment they had, including the heaviest piece of equipment, which is a 100-pound gravity pendulum. And I want you to bookmark that in your brains because that is going to come back into play later. And they build a shelter, which you can see here. They brought prefabricated items so they could construct it easily. And there was a seam of coal nearby that they knew they could mine to help heat the structure. They also build a little science shack where they set up all their scientific equipment with the goal of measuring wind speeds, barometric pressure, gravitational forces, ice depths, tides, much more. And this is where Edward Israel really excels. He and the men take up to 500 measurements every day, and they document everything with scientific precision. In addition to the science, Greeley has another mission. He wants members of his team to be the people that set the record for going furthest north. Now, the record for this had previously been held by an Englishman, a man named Albert Hastings Markham, and he set it back in 1876. But Greeley's like, we can break the record. So in April of 1882, he sends out men, and in fact, they do break the record, going a full 4 miles past Markham's record. So they were really excited. And in the process of doing that, they pretty much proved that this idea of the open polar sea at the top of the world just really isn't quite possible. I'm sure they wanted there to be a lovely warm sea at the top of the planet, but that's just not how the science works when you get further away from the equator. So all in all, Greeley at this point feels really proud. The expedition is doing remarkable things. They're setting new records. They're getting incredibly valuable scientific data, and it's all due to his leadership and the quality of his men, including Edward Israel. Now, as I mentioned, the expedition was supposed to be at Fort Conger for 2 years, and the idea was that after 1 year, a ship was supposed to resupply the men and take anybody back who, for example, was experiencing medical issues and needed to go home. So the first year, the relief ship that tries to get to the men is called the Neptune, and it stalls out a few hundred miles south of Fort Conger because it simply cannot get through the ice. But no worries. This was all planned for. The plan was that if the relief ship couldn't get back to Fort Conger, it would go to that second dot you see on the map, a place called Cape Sabine, and they would leave their supplies there and then sail back home. Great plan. Inexplicably, however, the Neptune does not do this. It literally turns around. It's unclear kind of why, but it really literally turns around with its hull packed full with all of the food that it was supposed to leave at Cape Sabine. The following year, in June of 1882, 2 ships called the Proteus and the Antics set sail for Greeley and his men. But the Proteus gets stuck in the ice, and while thankfully none of the crew are killed, the entire ship sinks with all of Greeley's provisions on board. That leaves the Antic, which now has to rescue all the guys from the Proteus and drop supplies, little supplies it can for Greeley and his men. So the Proteus the Antic saves the men from the Proteus, but only drops off a few supplies and then heads home again. Greeley, of course, at this time knows none of this. All Greeley knows is that the failure of the second ship to arrive activates a new plan. Greeley had orders. This was all planned for. Greeley's orders said specifically that if the second resupply ship failed to reach the men, that they had to go down south to Cape Sabine and winter there, surviving on the stores that both ships had left for them, and they'd await rescue to early spring, in the early spring. And so Greeley follows his orders and decides to do that. So on August 9th, 1883, he and his crew head south to Cape Sabine. It's a 250-mile trek. It is bleak, it is dangerous, it is frozen. The ice cracking and groaning is nearly constant, and it's so incredibly loud that the men call it the Devils Symphony. The men battle the ice and the elements, and none of them have experience on the water. Fortunately, the crew has Edward Israel, and he's able to take meridian observations to determine their location. He could also navigate with the help of the stars. And without his help, the men certainly would have been adrift and unable to even reach Cape Sabine, but thankfully, after 50 days, the entire crew makes it there with no fatalities, which is remarkable. Of course, when they get to Cape Sabine, they realize the brutal truth, which is that none of the supplies that they thought were there are available to them. So Greeley and his men found a little bit of food, a few caches of clothes and blankets, but nothing substantial. It's sub-zero temperatures, and it's about to be dark every day for months. There's no fuel, and they're trapped by ice from rescue. One of the things that the men carried on their journey was their most advanced scientific instrument, that gravity pendulum I mentioned earlier. It was valuable and also really heavy. So at one point in their journey down to Cape Sabine, Greeley says to the men, "We can just leave this thing behind," but they refuse. They take it with them, which is pretty symbolic, and it shows you how much they truly valued the science of this mission. And when they get to Cape Sabine and realize how very dire their situation is, it's also very symbolic that they turn this gravity pendulum, this precision instrument that they just dragged hundreds of miles and value so deeply, they turn it into a rescue beacon, and that is the picture that you see here. They mount it just off the shore of Cape Sabine, where they hope a passing ship might see it. And so essentially the men get to Cape Sabine in September of 1883, and now their mission is simply to survive until a rescue ship can get to them. As you can imagine, this is a brutal, unforgiving landscape, but they try to build a shelter. They overturn one of the boats that they arrived in. They build a stove. The interior of the hut stays between 15 and 30 degrees on a good day. They do their best to forage any food that they can. At one point, they actually shoot a bear, which gives them like 400 pounds of meat, which is great, but even that's not enough to sustain all of them. And they wind up hunting shrimp in the nearby bay. They catch them, but they're small and hard to eat and almost impossible to peel. So by January 1884, the men begin to die of starvation. And at this point, Edward Israel journals about some of the deaths of his colleagues. So Friday, April 4th, 1884, Fred L. died this a.m. at 9. He was buried before dinner. Lynn is worse today. Hunter's unsuccessful. Sunday, April 6th, 1884, Lynn became unconscious at 2 p.m. today and died at 7 p.m. Jewel was too weak to attend ICE today. Jens took his place, and on it goes. Edward Israel's last journal entry was on April 14th, and he passed away about a month later on May 27th, 1884. The day Edward died, Greeley wrote this in his journal, quote, "His unswerving integrity during these months of agony has been a shining example, And although his sacrifices were lost to a few, still the effect has produced good fruit. For lack of strength, we could not bury him today. Finally, on June 22nd, 1884, the surviving members of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition are found at Cape Sabine and rescued. There were only 7 of the 25 left. Remarkably, what had survived almost fully intact were the scientific records of the expedition, which had been sealed and stored as best the men could. The bodies of the men were carefully loaded into the waiting ship, and the surviving men were given food and medical care, but unfortunately, one of the surviving men died within a short time of being rescued. So that left 6 men who were left alive, and they are pictured here, and Lieutenant Greeley is in the front row. His beard is much trimmed, front row right. And at first, when the survivors get home, they're greeted with a hero's welcome, but soon these terrible rumors of cannibalism spread like wildfire among the newspapers. And while autopsies of some of the bodies had shown flesh being stripped away, there was a chance it was from the men trying to capture those tiny shrimp in the bay. And Greeley, for his part, denies any knowledge of cannibalism and says, quote, "I know of no law, human or divine, that was broken at Sabine." When Edward Israel's body is brought back to Kalamazoo, the whole town turns out to greet it. The businesses close, the mayor and the city council attend his funeral, and he's buried in the Jewish cemetery in town, and this historical marker was erected near his gravesite in 1972. His mom was given some of the plants that Edward had collected on his expedition, and then she generously donated them back to the University of Michigan. And today, this plant here, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, it exists in the University of Michigan herbarium, and if you look at the collection information, it does indeed say that Edward Israel collected it. So Edward's death no doubt affected Mark Walrod Harrington deeply, and it certainly prompted him to write that strange profile piece in an academic journal. And he may have felt some guilt recommending Israel for the expedition in the first place. And it's also possible that the tragedy shifted something loose in Harrington that may never have been right again, because Harrington left the University of Michigan in 1891 to lead the U.S. Weather Bureau, and then he briefly became president of the University of Washington in Washington State. And then one night in 1899, he told his wife he was going out to dinner. He walked out the door, and he never came back. For the next decade, very little is known about him. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch reports at one point in 1901 that he's logging in the Pacific Northwest. In 1902, the New York Times writes about him being in a Chicago flophouse with this headline, quote, "An ex-college president among the tramps." Then in 1907, Harrington is discovered in a New Jersey asylum. He could still converse in several languages, read Latin, and chart the constellations. Harrington's son had tracked him down there, and he did not recognize his own son. And he really never recovered from this, and he spent the remainder of his life in the asylum before passing away in 1926. And while Harrington's end is tragic, and really this whole story is super tragic, I want to leave you with a small silver lining to all of it. And the silver lining is this: that the scientific contributions of Lieutenant Greeley, Edward Israel, and the other men on that expedition were absolutely unprecedented and incredible. Their data was unparalleled, and it matters even today, especially today. It's the data that they collected that tells us that the seas are getting warmer, that the ice is diminishing, that glaciers have declined, that permafrost has thawed. It is the expedition's data that tells us all of this, and it sounds the alarm on climate change. We can thank their unparalleled determination to save the science they collected, because that information is one of the definitive ways we know something is deeply wrong with our planet and that it's time to act. So it's one way that the legacy of these brave men lives on. Thank you.
Okay, can you set them up feet?
Thanks, Laura. So, not a moment too soon, we have a story about rebirth.
Mine is a happy ending.
Yeah.
I'm going to set my computer picture with some notes. How's that? Does that work for you, Chris? All right. So my story, first of all, I would like to say these two women are so amazing. I'm always so fascinated by like the extreme granular detail, from you knowing Greeley's beard was bushy because he'd been in the war in Antietam and lost some teeth. What? And then Kim writing for the national, writing to New York to get the father of the guy she wrote about's death certificate, to find out that he too had issues. So it's just kind of amazing. My story is a little bit simpler, and as editor of Michigan Today, part of my goal always is to really, it's so corny, but to really engage with people and to have them respond to my stories, to provoke them to respond. And so, there are a lot of elements that I look for in a story, and this piece that I'm about to share with you that was written by Jim Tobin, who is a beloved writer that's contributed to everything we've done in our careers here. He's just a great history writer, and people always respond to his stuff. So this is a story called The Tappan Oak, and it was a tale of life, death, and rebirth. And it was the kind of story that classically covers, oh wait, this is slide 2. It's a kind of story that, in a town called Ann Arbor, people are going to like trees. It's not too hard for me to figure out, okay, step 1. And also, people do favor stories about familiar campus icons, obviously, and this tree, being 250 years old, likely had the opportunity to interact with virtually every living alumnus that, had the opportunity to come to Ann Arbor, spend time on the Diag, et cetera. It also is named for U of M's first president, Henry Philip Tappan, who most graduates would have heard of at some point, and who probably saw the plaque, read about the Tappan Oak, and experienced it at some point. So I'm happy to report that we planned correctly, because almost 20,000 people have read this story in the course of about a year, and about 48 people wrote in their own memories and their own feelings about this story and how it affected them. And this person, Steve Gold, an alum from 68 and 75, really points out the kernel of something we all realize as residents of Ann Arbor, that the trees of Ann Arbor are nearly as significant as the people. And it's really true in so many ways. The thing about this story is that it's not just about a tree, although we did think we were writing a story, or that Jim would be following the story of a tree that gets chopped down. Those kind of stories are always sad. And it's so cute that this fellow, Randy Milgram, wrote, "I never imagined a story about a tree could make me weep, but here we are." Because the tree has its own hero's journey. I mean, the elements that we love about stories are, having a hero, having a mission, being transformed, a little bit of tragedy, a little bit of suspense, and then, a nice, happy ending. And so this tree literally had its own hero's journey. It came, and it was a very clever device to tell the history of the university through this tree's own experience. So, for instance, it came from an acorn that apparently fell off a tree that was on land originally populated by the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. A fellow named Elijah Rumsey purchased the land from these native tribes, and he's known as one of the original founders of Ann Arbor. So he factors in the story since he bought the land, and not a whole lot is known about him, although I'm sure Kim and Laura probably know a lot more about him. He died in August 1827 due to a fever. And he's buried in Forest Hill Cemetery here in Ann Arbor with a headstone that bears the inscription, "The First Settler in Ann Arbor." So then we also have an opportunity to learn about President Tappan a little bit. He's responsible for the old part of this building that we're standing in, was the very first president of the university, and actually was fired by the Board of Regents. So that's maybe a little known fact. It also gives us an opportunity to meet a fellow named Andrew Dixon White, who came to the university from Yale back in the day in 1857. And Yale apparently was much leafier than Ann Arbor was at the time. And so he started just planting his own trees, and Kim has a beautiful story about him at her website, where he began to for his own love of trees, started planting a bunch of trees. A lot of students participated in that with him. And by this point, this bur oak had started to grow. The students decided to name it after President Tappan. And as part of their class gift, they planted trees in concentric circles around the Tappan oak and left a plaque describing their activities. So by the time, at this point now, the Civil War is starting to cook up. These boys are leaving campus to go to the war. And by the time they come back, so many of them have died. It's so sad, and Andrew Dixon White is known to have said, "I fear there are more trees now than boys." So it's really sad. So he was very attached to his trees. And so it's also a hero's journey by virtue of this character, Chase Griffith, who we meet in this story. So now he's a contemporary student in 2013 or so. He's kind of an unhappy U of M student, sad, grew up in this area, not very enchanted by the University of Michigan, lonely, and he spends a lot of time on the diag under the Tappan oak and loves it so much there, takes so much comfort in it that one day he scoops a bunch of acorns into his backpack and goes on his merry way. He graduates, and he goes on to pursue a graduate degree at MSU in arborism. He becomes a fabulous arborist. And in the meantime, sort of feeling sentimental about his days with the Tappan oak, even though he was, not so happy here, starts growing some acorns and starts to see some saplings appear. Puts them in his father's backyard in Saline and kind of holds on, fingers crossed. So now suddenly, the story is taking a little bit of a turn from, oh, what a sad day, this 250-year-old oak that's been here forever and has endured all these things has died from a virus of all things. So now we've got Chase in the picture, and as one of our readers points out, it's so cute. He basically retold the whole story in his comment. His name's George Fonin, a 1971 MBA grad. He says, great historical recollection that in 1858, Andrew Dixon White and students named the native oak tallest tree on campus in President Henry Philip Tappan's honor. And that in 2013-14, with his good nature, student Chase Griffith gathered Tappan oak acorns, 2 of which he has nurtured to 4-foot sturdy oak saplings, now offering one to Michael Rutowski, the campus forester, to plant and carry forward the strong life spirit of the Tappan oak and the University of Michigan. So as Jim had been pursuing this story and learning about the life and death of this tree, one of the groundskeepers here told him this story about Chase. And now suddenly he calls me and says, you're never going to believe what I just found out. The tree's coming back. It's still alive. It was so great. So this reader, just like I felt, he said, and so heartening that the Tappan oak tale brings back my recollections of the treasured trees at the center of the campus by the old physics lecture hall and West Engine Hall when I was there in the 50s. I loved to see the great trees then and have for a lifetime when visiting the campus. I'm grateful that the university community values and carries forward the strong life spirit of the Tappan oak and all the majestic natural landmarks of the University of Michigan. So as an editor of this publication that goes to 475,000 people, my job is to make those people feel warm and nostalgic about their university and have happy memories, or not even necessarily happy memories, but feel a strong connection to the place. And so this piece really kind of did that for everyone, felt very reminiscent and nostalgic. So I thought this was kind of interesting. This tree had so many different roles over the years, or the ways that it represented campus life to people. And so this person, Randall Smith, wrote in his memory of Bump Elliott, one of the football coaches back in the 50s, once hung in effigy from this powerful symbol. So it's like this tree just saw a lot. It saw, the Depression, the advent of the space travel, creation of the internet. It saw a lot of our life here at the university from all these stories these two were just telling of those people, let alone the protests in the 60s and everything else. And so, it bore witness to a lot of Michigan life, and then the fact that it was going to be gone was pretty sad. So to get another crack at the Acorn, you know, was a pretty thrilling thing. So in terms of like storytelling and storytelling devices, now we've got this sweet plot twist that has just taken the story into a whole nother place than we really thought we were going to begin with. And so one of our other readers, Jared Cantor, in 2006, he's talking about his memories of the tree. And it's so funny, like the different things that people remember and what they choose to share. So he says, I have many fond memories of walking this area of the Diag and gazing up at that majestic tree. And the word majestic got used quite a bit in people's comments. And he says, this story, and this is what I want people to do, and this is what's so great when they do stuff like this. This story has inspired me to go look through long forgotten photos, taken on a Palm Pilot, no less, of a friend of mine trying to interact with the many squirrels who loved the tree in that area of campus. So, you know, I just sent that person down memory lane, or Jim did, with this story. So, you know, just that's the kind of energy we're trying to produce without, you know, blowing smoke. You know, we're just trying to remind you of the wonderful things that happen here and the people here. So this person says, you know, now we're thinking a little bit about academics at the moment. So this person recalls the difficult tree identification class that I almost failed. So we're even bringing back memories of, you know, hard school days, which, you know, Chase himself was experiencing, not loving life here. But, you know, this story gives us a chance to get to know him a little bit and find out that, you know, he was still able to find wonder in nature, you know, even though he was a little bit sad, and he was present. And we have to remember to be present. You know, he loved that tree so much, he picked up an acorn because he kind of wanted to carry it around in his pocket, and now we are basically awaiting the return of a sapling of this tree's progeny, you know. So it's one of those lovely little circle of life kind of stories, which I love. But it really teaches us that, you know, there's this sort of eternal circle that, and a simple action that one person takes, picking up some acorns, he's going to bring a lot of happiness to a lot of people, particularly the nearly 8,000 people that read this story who are anxiously awaiting the tree's return. So it's got a nice little underlying theme for the reader to realize, you know, we should be a little bit more like Chase, and now we can be excited that this tree's coming back. Except for a fellow named Kenneth Shepler, a 1975 grad, who, like Chase, also went to MSU for some grad work, and he said, how appropriate that an MSU grad is providing the replacement tree for U of M. They can never lose a chance to get a dig in. I went to MSU, so, you know, what can I say? But, so it's just kind of one of those things where you just realize, like, from this little tiny acorn, in fact, I have acorn earrings on today that I recently got. I just love the concept that within this acorn is all this potential for a tree. And it's the same thing about our lives, and it's the same thing about a story, particularly this story. We thought we were writing one story, and then it blossomed into this whole beautiful other concept. And this is really kind of this is another beautiful aspect of this story. This reader said, you know, we need the big old trees to remind us we're transient creatures. And James Tobin, we need him to tell us great stories that enrich our lives. And that is exactly what, you know, my job is. So I was very happy that this person seemed to agree. You know, it's not just about the tree now. Also, this story also gave us some interesting other little pathways and insights into U of M history, where we discovered this poem. Jim found a poem that a student had written back in 1886, a fellow named Dubel Arquet. So in the Argonaut, he wrote a poem about the Tappan Oak, which I would have printed if I could figure that out. But it's just really a sweet poem. He goes, we are gathered round the Tappan Oak, fresh from alma mater's halls. Soon must school life's binding links be broke. How fond memory recalls. The days are gone by, softly we sigh under the Tappan Oak. So it goes on. It's a really sweet poem. So it turns out that not only did that poem exist, but you may be wondering about
this artwork, this blue leaf that you're looking at. It's kind of hard to find a compelling picture of a tree that you can specifically say is the Tappan oak, and we really didn't have great photography on it. But what we did discover was this in 2017, when we were celebrating the university's bicentennial, this man named Fritz Swanson, who's a lecturer here in the English department's writing program, and he is also director of Wolverine Press, he was at the time, he found the poem and decided to also ask the grounds crew to pick up some leaves from the tree, and then they took it into the press, the Wolverine Press, inked up both sides of the leaf, put it in between two poem blanks, and ran them through the press for pressure. This produced a print of both sides of the leaf. And then he says, that tree meant a lot to me personally and to so many people on campus. Thank you for inviting me to celebrate it again with these prints. Best, Fritz Swanson. So then I had a chance to kind of even interact with Fritz Swanson. So that was kind of cool and find out what he felt and how he was paying tribute to the tree. And the thing that's so great about this story is that it just has the capacity to remind us all how much we love that time in our life. I mean, you think back on the shady diag or whatever, and how much we loved college, the diag, the shade, the squirrels, the grass, the hammocks, the frisbees, the bikes, the flyers, the posters, the kiosks, the chalk messages, the student organizations, the protests, the megaphones, snowball fights, you know, this enduring, electric, ongoing life force of the college campus that shaped us and that tree for all those years. And people really really felt that deeply when they read this story. And measuring the success by the comments is something very satisfactory to me. And the fact that this one got 48 comments was really great. And I'm just going to read this last one that really kind of captures the essence of it all. So this guy's name is Steve Gold. He graduated, well, clearly from English language and literature, as you'll understand by his note, and also human nutrition. So he says, trees on Central Campus like the Tappan oak, trees in the Arb, trees along the shady streets. I remember literally hugging a huge oak on Lincoln south of Hill Street, drifting home in the small hours from a smoky, boozy party circa 1970. They helped the multiple ways to create the atmosphere of the place and time. Tobin's wonderful story leads me to reflect on how trees span generations, stay solidly there in their quiet there-ness for life after life. I tell my little granddaughters how I used to lie on the shaded grass near the grad library, holding an acorn or a fragment of sandwich in my outstretched hand for the squirrel bold enough to come and take it from me. Maybe 20 years from now, they will do the same, risking a bite to feed the many times removed descendants of my 60s squirrels under the spreading canopies of the exact same trees that were there for me and the squirrels half a century ago. The Tappan oak is gone, but its germ will live on as a mighty oak on Central Campus. I'll be gone, but my granddaughters will live on as mighty women here or somewhere. Thoreau says we stand always, quote, on the meeting of two eternities, past and present, which is precisely the present moment. Reading James Tobin's story has made this morning an excellent present moment for me, and I'm grateful. So all I can say to that is thank you to my fabulous readers and writers who write in, because, you know, I'm forever grateful for that beautiful content that they provide. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you all. That was wonderful. And as I was listening, I think that it's clear that there's at least one resonance across these stories, and I guess it has to do with heroism, right? Deborah, you talked about Chase Griffith's heroism. You talked metaphorically about the heroism of the Tappan oak and what that represents. Lara, clearly the scientific heroism of this group. And am I right that Israel was the only actual scientist on this team? Okay. But these were mostly military guys who became so committed to this mission and to the science of the mission that they didn't want to give up the pendulum, and look what they've produced. And then Kim, in your story there are different kinds of heroism. There's the heroism of students, or the foolhardiness of students, I guess, rushing into a burning building to rescue academic material. There's the heroism of some of the faculty who lost things but who came back anyway from that. And I suppose there's even, in some sense, the heroism of Robert Stacy in some ways. So I just want to say that and have you react in some ways to that.
Every time I look at that photo of the students on the fire escape, I just think that would never happen today. I don't even know that we have fire escapes like that on buildings, but there's just so many reasons I don't think that would happen. And I was just like, wow. And the fire chief even said this would have been even more devastating if that was possible, if not for the efforts of students.
Wow.
And I also think about Robert Stacy. I think he must have had some incredible pain because of losses in his life, and that he lived with that, and he still persevered and made something of his life. So there's so many unanswered questions about him, but like his stepdaughter said, he did make a career that he wanted to achieve. So,
Other reactions?
I think one of the things that I thought was so profound is I mentioned that I can't, it doesn't, there's no red light, I don't know if that matters. Okay, cool. Can I borrow yours?
I don't know.
No, I have 3. Hi.
can you hear Laura?
I'm a star. Okay. Anyway, one of Edward's hesitations for going on this mission was that his mom was a widow, and he had siblings, and he was really worried that him leaving would, and he just was so worried about leaving her, and she encouraged him to go. And the fact that, he didn't come back, she could have been bitter. I think she could have been really upset. I mean, I'm sure she was upset, but she could have been bitter and angry. And the fact that she sort of did this really beautiful thing of giving back that plant to the herbarium, I think just at time after time with this story, people do the sort of right thing and the generous thing. And it's astounding.
Hello. I don't know if it works or not. Yeah, and similarly, Chase offering that tree, he was the one who called U of M to let them know that he was successful in growing 2 of them into pretty robust saplings. And it's so true that so often people say, like, the true sign of optimism or bravery or whatever is planting a tree that you'll never live to see develop into a 250-year-old bur oak that's majestic and incredible. But the fact that he is going to create this happiness for people in the future, or a new shady spot on the diag, is just a really beautiful thing that he'll never be able to enjoy. But just passing it along, I think, is that's an act of heroism for sure. And I do think, just the optimism of knowing you got to keep going, got to keep planting the trees.
That's great. Deborah, if I could continue with you, do we know what's going to happen? Do we know when and where?
I feel like Jim just talked to him recently, and they're still waiting. He's not ready to turn it over yet. It needs a little more time. But I don't know exactly where they're going to plant it. Maybe they'll put it back in the same place. I'm not sure.
There was also discussion of taking the wood from the oak, from the Tappan oak, and doing things with it.
Yeah, a lot of times they do repurpose them into benches and decorations and block M's. I'm not sure how much of that wood was able to be repurposed, because the virus that killed it did hollow out much of the trunk. Mm-hmm. So it was in pretty bad shape, sadly. Yeah, so.
And didn't Chase's father mow over some saplings?
So Chase, our little friend, he was growing them in his dad's backyard, and unfortunately his dad mowed over a few of them, and so Chase was like, stop everything, and was able to rescue the 2 that they're like very valuable. So he's giving one to MSU and one to us. So it's kind of
but we could have had the Tappan Grove.
Yeah. We could have had a whole little batch of them, but we will now. They'll just keep dropping acorns, so it'll just keep happening. I just love that ongoing circle.
Laura, I wanted to ask you, first of all, do we know much about Edward Israel's life at U of M? And that's one question. The other is, what are sort of the primary sources for what we know about all of this?
Seal this back. I wish that my colleague Andrew Rutledge was here. He is the real historian. I just read a book called it was called Something in the Ice by Buddy Levy. Gosh, I'm so sorry. I can't remember the title of it. But so I read this book by Buddy Levy, which is chock full of primary sources. I highly recommend it. I think it might be called A Tragedy in the Ice. I might have stolen his title. And I will say it's nonfiction that reads like fiction. It is so very good, and it's just so compelling. And the thing is, in Edward Israel's alumni file, there really just isn't that much. I wish we knew more about him. Andrew and I tried really hard to find additional photos of him. We found that one from the expedition, but we weren't able to locate much more about him. So unfortunately, I'm not able to fill in much about his life on campus. But certainly, we do know that he was this academic superstar, and the idea that he was in this place with Mark Walrod Harrington and really being nurtured and mentored by him is pretty cool.
Thank you. And Kim, the story you set out to write.
Yes.
About the people who were impacted by the fire.
Right.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Who sort of came through okay and who didn't? Yeah.
Dwight Dumond, who I mentioned, the Civil War historian, he regrouped and he wrote a very powerful book about the history of the Civil War and the cause. And he basically said it was slavery, it was racism. And it came out, maybe somebody knows, I think 63, 64, and it unleashed the most incredible racist letters to him for, calling it racist, the war. But it was a wildly popular book and received a lot of accolades. There was another faculty member, Palmer Throop, also in the history department. He was writing on Italy, early Italy, the Renaissance. He lost everything. He said he was going to regroup. He was given an additional sabbatical to do this, and he never recovered his career in that area. So it's very sad. I can't even imagine.
No, it's
That's why I appreciate that there's the cloud and there's thumb drives and everything.
It's real.
It's just amazing what you can find about these people, and how deep their stories go and how interesting they are. And then it's fascinating what you uncovered, both of you.
So I want to invite the audience in and online. You can put questions in the comments and Austin will convey them. And if you're in the audience and want to ask a question, please wait for Meggie to bring a microphone over to you so that we can get it onto the stream and onto the recording. So any questions at this point? Okay. Well, raise your hand anytime, and let's just keep going. So, in general, this is for all of you, I guess. What advice would you give a young writer who was interested in writing about the University of Michigan?
Visit the Bentley.
I was going to say, go to the Bentley. You got to go to the Bentley.
Yeah, right?
That wasn't a plan.
There's so many great stories to read about the University of Michigan that are out there, that have been written. Kim's site, the Heritage site, Laura's magazine, the stories that are in Michigan Today. They're so, and you feel kind of dumb saying, oh, you should read the story I wrote. But it's more because the story itself is fascinating. And there's a great series, Kim, you guys both worked on it, I think, that Detroit Public Television series.
Yes. Yep, for the bicentennial.
Jim's books, her articles have been compiled into books, into the colors. You guys did that 200-year anniversary book. And it's the thing that you can tell by the way these stories have been written and then described and retold. They're really, really interesting. It's not like some boring old, university text. They're like thrillers and really interesting mysteries and fascinating people. So well, like when the new president came and now we have a new VP of communications, I feel like we should give them a list. Like, especially that DPTV series was so good.
Yeah,
It just
and
really captures.
I believe President Ono watched it.
Good, good.
So that was nice.
It gives you a nice overview,
Yeah.
and then you can figure out how to write a story maybe by reading a lot of them. And
Yeah. Well, I think I would tell students that there is a lot of material out there already from many sources, is to take a look at it and try to find a different angle. You know,
Yeah.
Jim Tobin, who we have all worked with, he would say, pull the thread.
Yep.
Pull the thread and see how things unravel, because you're just going to find something new and interesting.
Which is what happened with your story,
Yeah,
totally.
yeah. It's like, here's a story I'm going to do, and then it totally blows up and becomes something different. And I just think there has to be an element of curiosity. And then when you're stumped, you talk to people like Greg Kinney and Brian Williams and say, can you please help me? What do you guys have here at the Bentley that might inform what I'm trying to do?
I'm so interested too by the questions, like that you're like, why did this person write this story for this publication? I don't even think that would have occurred to me to ask, you know what I mean? Like, and then that takes you down a path, you know? So just wondering, just being curious and keep asking stuff to find out.
One thing that was interesting about the arsonist story was there's a history class, I think it still happens every year, where they do their own research at the Bentley on a given topic. And maybe a year or two after the Heritage Project story was published, this class was looking at mental health at Michigan. And so they took 4 or 5 sort of episodes or chapters from university history, and each student or team of students worked on it and sort of looked at how the university addressed mental health, didn't address mental health, whatever. And they used Robert Stacy as one example. But that was just a sense of, here's how you can come at it from a different angle. And they looked at other episodes in campus history.
Yeah, they produced a website. This is on the Michigan in the World.
Michigan in the World, thank you.
Project.
Yes, LSA and History
Wonderful,
Department.
wonderful stuff. Yeah, that's a Bentley history collaboration. So, yeah.
Another thing too, I like just having those elements. If there is a mystery, or there is a journey, or there is a transformation, all those classic story elements, you need conflict, you need
tension.
Yeah, you need your dynamic character and your main character, and like all that kind of stuff. So, and a nice arc to take it over the edge.
I think you need voices. So you can find that in diaries, in memoirs, in newspaper clippings. That helps breathe some life into it.
Yeah, you often hear people say, "Well, I'm not really interested in history," or I took history. I took history in high school and I couldn't stand it, and so forth. But clearly, people engage with history. I mean, it's the same thing at the Bentley when students come and they actually get to hold something, a 100-year-old document, and look at it and figure out what was going on. They are enthralled. I mean, so.
I think too, what is great about the Bentley and the University of Michigan is that like whatever you're interested in, like U of M is so big and it's been around for so long, like whatever you're interested in, you can find a story about it. I mean, I was joking with Gary earlier, like I'm really lucky. Last year I did a talk on UFOs. Like I get to write about the coolest stuff, and there's just you could be interested in anything and find a really cool U of M story about it.
I wrote a story about Henry Tappan's dog, because he had this famous dog on campus, and it's like, and it was a way to sort of tell the history of the university, but through the experiences of Leo, his great pooch.
You need a good main character.
Yep.
And who doesn't love a dog story?
Of course.
So, since our audience isn't asking questions, we'll nudge. Right? Do you guys have any questions for each other about the talk you just gave?
Well, I remember reading Jim Tobin's story about the Tappan Oak, and I sent him an email, and I said, only you could write a story about a tree and have me tearing up reading it. It is an absolutely beautiful story to read. It's so well done.
And I mean, who doesn't love a tree? And like, I mean, I don't know. It just, everything about it was so perfect, that story. Really nice.
Yep.
And the fact that it had a happy ending really did help.
and it went in an unusual direction.
Yeah, it's another one of those things, just a very casual conversation with the groundskeeper, and the groundskeeper volunteered it. Like, it wasn't like Jim said, hey, by the way, did anyone pick up some acorns? You know, he was basically asking just to write about its history and then call it a day, and then we got this sweet little gem, so.
Kim, I have a question for you.
Okay.
I envy many times of the stories that you find and tell. They're just so well done, and I'm like, how did you find this? And like, I just kind of wondered, how do you find your stories, and how many are like, do you have sort of a list that you go through, and you know, 80% don't turn into anything and 20% are real, or how do you, what's your process?
Jim Tobin and I, Jim is my colleague on the Heritage Project, so we talk a lot about stories we would like to do. Stories we've come across, and often it's because it's in maybe a history of the university, or something you come across in the daily, which is now digitized, which is a great resource. And again, it's just that there's just something, a little thing might jump out, and I'll go, well, what is that? And the one that always comes to mind is there's a book by Howard Peckham, The History of the University of Michigan, or it's sort of the definitive history of the university. Well, the encyclopedic survey is, but it's a history of the university. It's not the most compelling read, but it's got a lot of facts, a lot of names, and whatnot. And there's one sentence in this book about a chemistry professor being blinded in a laboratory accident. And I'm like, huh, how did that happen? And it just turned into this incredible story about this poor young junior faculty member doing an experiment with the students. Things blow up. He literally has his eyes destroyed. And he goes on to teach for, 35 more years. He's very popular, and he writes papers, and everything in Braille. So you just kind of go, what's going on here? And the really cool addendum to that story is, and that was published, 7 or 8 years ago. This professor, Edward Campbell, he had a home designed for him by Albert Kahn. It's at the corner of Hill and Washtenaw. The people who live there now sent me an email and said, we just read your article. Would you like to come over and see the house? Nice. It's like, yeah. And that was a very fun afternoon.
That's so cool.
So yeah, I guess it's just that curiosity and asking that push. I think about Robert Caro, if anybody's read his biographies of Lyndon Johnson. I mean, he's sort of the definitive biographer. And he wrote a book on writing and doing historical research. And the thing that stuck with me in that book is he says, always, turn the page. So when you're going through those musty folders, turn one more page, because there just might be something on the back of a piece of paper, or looking through the Ruthven papers, I'm trying to find stuff on faculty and fire loss, and there's this letter from Robert Stacy. It's like, holy cow.
Yeah. See, the problem with us is that we would keep, you could never get out of there.
I know, that's the hard thing. Is when do you stop? When do you stop?
Yeah, it's hard to walk away. There's so much cool, just amazing things in there. I love the archives.
Oh, so do I.
Yeah, Greg. And almost a follow-up on that. Do you ever come to a point where you decide this story is not going to work, but something that seemed like a really good idea, but
yes,
either the resources aren't there or it just isn't as compelling as you thought it might be?
Yes, I'm not going to tell you what the story is, but I spent some time researching it. I thought it was a story. I wrote it. And there's this little voice in the back of my head that's like, this is not a story. I sent it to Jim because we edit each other's stuff, and he wrote back and he said, well, this really doesn't feel like a story. And it's like, you're right. I just hoped I could just sneak it past you. Sort of like getting mom or dad to sign the report card. Maybe he'll just say, yeah. And so I set those aside, and maybe I can use the material in some other way. It might inform another story. Yeah. But yeah, that's always frustrating when you think you're onto something and either the material's not there and you just have to have the material, or it's just not as compelling as you hoped or thought it might be. So.
Yeah, the artwork, those assets make such a big difference.
Oh yeah.
The images and then the artifacts that you're both showing are amazing. Just the the records, just to see the handwriting, and such a rare. It always makes you wonder, like, what are people going to find out about us someday? Like,
Right.
What is out there, like some weird document with your name on it or something? I don't know.
I had a story about a Michigan writer who is dead and shall remain nameless. And I was really excited to do this piece. I was so excited, and I got into the collection and discovered that they were a liar. They beat their first wife.
No.
And they're a pretty celebrated Michigan writer. So I had to take a step back and just hit the pause button, because I'm still not sure what to do with this story. But that it could be, it's potentially controversial. And again, they're very dead. It's hundreds of years ago. So,
Let's see. See a playwright.
Can't libel a dead man.
So anyway, it's super interesting. Like, these are the kinds of things that, I might not be able to write it right now, but maybe someday.
Yeah. Sometimes you just need that time, a little bit of space.
Yeah. Figure out what to do with it.
And, sometimes the national mood informs things.
Yes.
That's so true.
Yes.
Gary, I just have to offer a comment. As someone who's worked with Kim Clark 3 different times through our careers, I have one thing, that just when you write about history, you have to have time. And something that writers often don't have is the time to do the investigation, to do the research, to reach out to the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th and the 6th source. And that's what makes these stories so compelling, I think. And in my experience is also that these, when done well, these can be some of the most popular stories of any readership group. We often refer to Kim Clark as the Queen of the Gateway, because when we feature her stories on the U of M Gateway News, on the Gateway, the clicks go through the charts. It's awesome, and it's across all readers, generations, and I don't mean to just focus on Kim, because I get to work with all of these people and read their work, and it's incredibly valuable, and that somebody is giving them the time to do this work, and to paraphrase a horrible commercial, to be curious.
Yes.
And continue to be curious is really valuable.
Thanks, Rick. I think that's a great comment, and I mean, I have to say that I think we are fortunate that there is enough of a commitment at this institution to the institution's history, and that, and I mean, these are people who have helped build that commitment and convince others that they should be so committed. So maybe as one last question, what can we look forward to seeing in the next few months? Stories or.
I have a crazy one that I just published, so I didn't want to do it for this presentation, and it didn't have all the engagement that I like to brag about. But it's a really good history story that an alum wrote a book, and you never know if it's a first-time writer, wasn't sure if it was going to be a great book or not. Perfectly fine, pretty good book. Compelling story about a former regent and governor of Michigan in the 1900s named another Chase Osborne. And this woman grew up, spent a lot of time in Pellston, Michigan, near the bio station. Her father was a professor here as well. So she grew up on Michigan campus and up north, and always saw this bust of this character. And as an older woman, she learned it was Chase Osborne and who he was. She started to do some research about him because she wanted to write a biography of him, because she had been intrigued by this bust through her whole childhood up north, and learned some stuff about him. And in a lot of the stories, just like Kim was saying, one sentence stands out. This writer, one sentence kept standing out in the history of this man. It was always him and his wife adopted a young woman named Stella Nova, who was a University of Michigan graduate. They adopted her when she was 37. And then the story would just go on. And they all she kept seeing, she's like 37. And nobody ever investigated, apparently, until she started looking into it. Turns out,
She had been corresponding with Chase Osborne as a graduate student in writing, and ultimately developed a relationship. He adopted her. He and his wife sort of had a secret divorce amongst themselves because he didn't want to be divorced and ruin his reputation. So his wife leaves. They lived in the Upper Peninsula on an island, Sugar Island and Duck Island. So the wife returned to the mainland and left the house, and the daughter moved in with her father. And so he was about 70-something at this time, and she was his writing assistant, and et cetera. So as the woman that I wrote the story about, her writing this story, she went to the Bentley in hopes of finding maybe a scrap or two that could confirm that these people were more than just adopted father and daughter, and she needed some clarification. She found 600 pages of correspondence, very ardent, between these two people from 1920 to 30, or like 27 to 37, or something to that effect. But to think that you would find 600 pages of back and forth, and he would often write back to her and annotate her letters and write little answers to them, not like correcting, but he would answer questions or expound on something she had written and then send it back to her. So she had a lot of her original stuff she had written to him, and then he, of course, saved his stuff. But in her opinion, the contemporary writer was saying, I believe she wanted to be heard, because no one ever talked about her, ever, until this, And so she goes, I think she wanted someone to find out someday, and there you go.
That she
One
exists.
person reads the sentence and goes, there's something more to this story. And now we know this whole tale, and it's quite fascinating. So, needless to say. Well, the book is called Ward, Wife, Widow. They were married about 24 hours before he died. He never married her until he was basically unconscious.
Okay.
She signed the papers. Yeah, it's a very short-lived marriage. Fascinating though. So sorry, that was kind of long-winded, but it's such an interesting tale.
So Gary had a Making Michigan recently featuring the story of Chandler Davis, who was one of 3 faculty who were fired during the Red Scare. And I like to have stories in the magazine where people are still alive and we can quote them, because that doesn't always happen. So we found with Gary's help, we were able to find a student who had done a documentary on Chandler Davis I think it was in the 80s, and he really helped bring this shameful part of Michigan's history back into the fore and helped get a little bit of, I won't call it justice, but help Chandler Davis's story be retold in that documentary. And his name is Adam Kulikow, and we were able to interview Adam and sort of tell this other part of the Chandler Davis story.
So we also do stories about stories.
Yeah, we do stories about stories.
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
we
it's
do.
coming out in the fall.
Cool. So I was up at the Bentley doing some research on an alum. His name is John Nakamura, Japanese-American young man, served in World War II and was killed. And I thought this would be kind of a cool story because he was Japanese-American. He had enlisted. He'd been unenlisted by the Army after Pearl Harbor. He re-enlisted. So as often happens when I'm at the Bentley, Brian Williams stops by at my table and says, what are you working on? And I told him, and he made a reference to the fact, we employed Japanese Americans on campus during the war. It's like, what? We had such a severe labor shortage during the war because the men on campus either had gone into the military or gone to work for the defense plants, like the bomber plant in Ypsilanti, which paid more. That we ended up going out to the internment camps in the western states and recruited Japanese American young men to come and work on campus. And hundreds of them came to work at U of M. So I am writing about that now. And poor John Nakamura is on the back burner, but I will write his story too. So.
Well, thank you all. Looking forward to all of those. Thank you so much for this discussion.
Oh, thank you.
And I want to encourage our audience, if you don't already know of these publications, Michigan Today, Collections Magazine, the Heritage Project, they're fantastic. Thanks to Austin Edmister for monitoring YouTube, Maggie Mustafai for handling the microphone, Michigan Media for producing the event tonight. Thanks, as always, to the audience here and online. Making Michigan will be back in September, so stay tuned for news about our fall events. This session will be on our website in about a week or so, if you want to rewatch or send it along to others. And if you've registered, you'll get an email saying when it's up. I want to remind you the observatory is open Friday afternoons. We're leading a lot of campus walks on Friday afternoons over the summer. We're also open Friday evenings for astronomy night and on Thursday evenings for various programming. So please check our website. If you're here at the observatory upstairs is going to be open until 9 o'clock. We have docents who are excited to show you things. And there's a lot of fascinating history upstairs if you haven't already seen it. So thank you again. Until we see each other, be safe, stay well, and keep up hope. Thank you.